For the better part of a century, the Caped Crusader has maintained a level of popularity rarely seen in characters on the cusp of entering the public domain, which may have something to do with the fact that he's constantly being reinvented. He's been a purple glove pulp avenger and a swashbuckling 70s love god, a camp icon, and a goth baddie. Frank Miller's iconoclastic boomer, Grant Morrison's avatar of determination, and Scott Snyder's absolute unit are all wildly different iterations of a timeless concept existing under the same cowl. The games have only been a little more consistent. Batman was created more than 80 years ago and has been starring in video games for about 40 of them, nearly half of his existence, but the dozens of Dark Knight games across countless platforms and console generations have rarely strayed that far from the basics. No matter what decade it is, no matter what hardware you're playing on, odds are that in any given Batman title you'll be gliding off gargoyles, firing grappling hooks, and flinging Batarangs at guys in straitjackets. Batman's regular retoolings in the comics have left the games mostly playing catch-up for the better part of their history, largely tied to popular movies and TV shows rather than taking the character someplace truly new. But within these constraints, and eventually beyond them, we've seen genuine masterpieces, slept-on gems, unmitigated disasters, and entries so bizarre and inexplicable they belong inside the Black Casebook. LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight is the latest and presumably most comprehensive Bat game to date, which means it's the perfect time to take stock of what that legacy actually looks like. Today we are delving into this 40-year history to find the wonderful toys buried amidst the guano. Here are the best, worst, and weirdest Batman games of all time. Batman's initial foray into electronic media arrived later than you might think. His world's finest frenemy Superman appeared in the first ever superhero video game back in 1979, preceding Bats' own inauspicious debut by 7 whole years. 1986 would prove to be a turning point in Batman's long history, the moment he would finally shake off the long shadow of the kitschy 60s Adam West TV series and become the brooding icon he was always meant to be. It was the year that Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns detonated our conception of the character in an operatic flash of lightning and violence and psychiatrist jokes. In a considerably less seismic development, it was also the year Ocean Software published Batman's first ever video game, a dinky isometric puzzler on the venerable ZX Spectrum. The British home computer scene had exploded in the early 80s thanks to affordable and accessible hardware like the Spectrum, Amiga, and Amstrad. In the days before a truly global gaming market, developers in the UK had honed their own unique approach to action. Stiff, heavy movements, plodding controls, and a curious fondness for anthropomorphic eggs. You might think this is an ill fit for the Batman, the ninja master who strikes quickly with surgical precision and leaps across rooftops to vanish into the night, and, well, frankly, you would be correct. The box art for Ocean's Batman depicts a determined, lantern-jawed beefcake of a bat, pumped up and poised to put some superstitious, cowardly goons in the hospital. Once you toss the cassette inside the Specky, however, you are treated with a very different Dark Knight. As an off-key rendition of the 60s Batman theme warbles from the computer's internal speaker, you're presented with this shrimpy, somewhat pot-bellied Batman who saucily taps his foot as he waits for you to press enter. The Joker and the Riddler have kidnapped Robin. Batman, trapped in his own cave and stripped of gadgets, must find the 7 missing pieces of his trusty Bat hovercraft to escape and pursue the dastardly duo. To do so, he'll have to slowly navigate 150 isometric screens populated by traps, puzzles, and monsters without any offensive capabilities whatsoever. Rather than the ultra-adept master of everything, here Batman is bereft of even basic video game functionality. Elementary video game verbs like jumping and carrying items require you to find hidden upgrades around the brutally difficult maze, rendered in a neon Zurin R nightmare of teals and yellows and purples. A superhero power fantasy, it is not. In 1988, Ocean published the second of its 3 Batman games, Batman the Caped Crusader, the first of many side-scrolling action games to come. Caped Crusader consists of 2 separate scenarios pitting the Dark Knight against the Penguin and Joker. Batman can now kick rats, throw batarangs, and flail listlessly at the hordes of identical henchmen, clogging his path through agonizing, samey-looking mazes. There's certainly more sauce on display than Ocean's previous effort, with a gnarly health meter that melts Batman's face into a skull, and a pretty decent song that serves as the Caped Crusader's only music track. The game's main selling point is its unique interface inspired by comic panels, where the screen is divided into narrow boxes through which the characters traverse. Entering doors creates a cascade effect that layers screens on top of each other, giving the Caped Crusader an almost fixed camera cinematic feel a la early Resident Evil. It's an admirable, if not always pleasant, innovation that made a genuine attempt to convey the comic experience, and you can understand why Ocean tried it. Comics were pretty much all Batman was known for at the time, save for some Super Friends cartoons and old memories of Adam West. However, that was about to change. Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie was a watershed moment for the character, creating the modern culture of superhero hype in the image of Michael Keaton's rubber-molded abs. For the first time in decades, there was a definitive Batman in the popular imagination, a fixed point that every adaptation since has had to reckon with. Game designers finally had something they could work with. Batman the movie, the game, was Ocean's swan song and easily the best title of this primordial bunch. No longer struggling to put their own stamp on the nebulous ideal of the Dark Knight, Ocean slapped Burton's iconography on a sequence of 5 minigames, each inspired by a set piece from the film. A common structure for the studio's licensed games of the era, and it serves the source material relatively well. The side-scrolling action is vastly improved. Batman can now fight and jump simultaneously, imagine that, and the grappling hook, or grapnel, makes its video game debut. More significant is the first appearance of a fast-paced Batmobile shooting gallery, which would soon become a franchise staple. There's even a charming breather on the Batcomputer where Bruce mixes chemicals around, the first real glimpse of the Master Detective in digital form. Batman was big business in 1989, and the game was a smash hit across 7 different PC platforms, particularly as a pack-in for a best-selling Amiga 500 bundle. The first good Batman game had arrived, but it would be Ocean's last patrol of Gotham. The British developers would take the backseat for now as the license passed to another island nation with its own very distinct approach to game design. Batman is at his best when he's in control. From the moment his parents hit the pavement, Bruce Wayne has poured enormous amounts of time, money, and human capital towards mastering every variable of his life and bending the world to his will. As Frank Miller's grizzled geriatric Dark Knight put it, the world only makes sense if you force it to. Getting that intensity across in a video game is tougher than it sounds, and even if you backburner the billionaire vigilante stoicism, it's still hard to embody the world's second greatest martial artist on the ZX Spectrum's squishy rubber keyboard. Enter that Japanese studio Sunsoft, whose NES adaptation would become not just a Bat classic, but one of the most beloved licensed games ever made. 1989's Batman opens on a black screen as a digitized, full-frontal body shot of Michael Keaton as Batman fades in, followed by the title. A wall of text and an opening cutscene set the stage as the Batmobile blasts through the night and the Caped Crusader leaps out. Cue Streets of Desolation, the Naoki Kodaka composed song easily worthy of the chiptune Hall of Fame. The finished game bears little resemblance to the movie's plot, pitting Batman against a bizarre bullpen of deep-cut DC criminals like Killer Moth and Electrocutioner. The second-to-last boss is a Z-lister named Firebug, and when you finally face the Joker, he summons lightning bolts from the sky, a feat, to our knowledge, that Jack Nicholson was not capable of in that film. Instead of the gargoyle-assisted demise depicted in the movie, Sunsoft's Batman just kinda unceremoniously dumps the Joker out the window. The game has a ton of personality, but it's not really Tim Burton's Baroque Gothic pulp. There's an almost Final Fight vibe to Gotham's criminal chaos, over-the-top urban combat energy where the final boss taunts you from a video screen in the penultimate level. Most of these departures are welcome, especially when it comes to feel and mechanics. In Burton's movie, Michael Keaton's costume is so hideously immobile that he largely fights by standing there and swinging his torso around. Sunsoft's Batman, however, doesn't have this problem. He marches across the screen in a flurry of punches and kicks, wielding 3 distinct sub-weapons, including a highly dubious spear gun, which indicates a similar laissez-faire adherence to the no-killing rule that Zack Snyder's Batfleck would adopt decades later. The Dark Knight jumps with crunchy anticipation and leaps from wall to wall like he's Ryu Hayabusa, a ninja in a cape and Kevlar. Sunsoft's Batman earns its comparison to Ninja Gaiden not just in feel, but in the cinematic cutscenes that punctuate each stage, if you can survive long enough to reach them. Sunsoft pounced on the huge success of its first Batman game and spread the love to several other platforms over the next year. A perfectly adequate adaptation of Batman for the Sega Genesis skewed more towards the slow and deliberate shinobi style versus the twitch mastery of Ninja Gaiden, while a fairly obscure arcade version looked great but suffered from early beat-em-up awkwardness, with hundreds of goons pouring from doors to decimate your life bar and your quarters. Both Both were notable for their inter-level bat vehicle sequences, side-scrolling shmups on Sega's console, and flashy first-person extravaganzas to turn heads at the arcade.
They stole my balloon!
Batman for Game Boy was another totally new game with miniature Mario Land sprites of a gun-wielding Dark Knight riddling his tiny foes with what we can only assume are rubber bullets. Video games don't have the best track records when it comes to Batman's strict aversion to firearms, but Batman on Game Boy is among the more comical dismissals of the trope. It's as solid as action games got on the original DMG-01 with another killer Sunsoft soundtrack. There's one more Batman game in Sunsoft's utility belt for the first Batman movie rollout, and it's a darn cute one. In Batman for the PC Engine, the Dark Knight is embodied as an adorably chubby avatar who putters around top-down mazes dressed to look like city streets and art museums. Batman scoots around collecting power-ups and cleaning paint, twirling bad guys with his Batarangs and booping them away. We've seen a silly-looking Cape Crusader before, but unlike the Ocean version, this is very specifically supposed to be Michael Keaton's intense and raw Avenger. This weird little guy, more Bomberman than Batman, is embodying the same person who screams and smashes vases and hooks up with Kim Basinger. The game is harmless fun with another excellent soundtrack, but the real joy comes from seeing digital stills from the film fade into the cheerful little goblin we control, or watching a chibi sprite coldly send the Joker plummeting to a grisly death. TurboGrafx 16 owners outside Japan never got the chance to experience this unintended whimsy as the PC Engine version never left its home territory. A shame to be sure, but not one that mattered for long. Batman Returns was looming, and with it a whole new class of developers to usher in the sophomore era of Batman games. But before the license moved on for good, Sunsoft had one last story all its own to tell, and it's a doozy. Batman Returns was still a year away in 1991, but Sunsoft decided to skip the line and issue its own sequel. Without a movie to adapt, the team ditched the Burtonian Gothic atmosphere in favor of full-throttle run-and-gun spectacle. This is a video game when it comes to technical pizzazz and sheer bombastic presentation. In the West, it was called Return of the Joker, but the Japanese title tells you everything you need to know: Dynamite Batman. Whatever you call it, this game has no business running on hardware from 1983. It looks and plays like Mega Man, Castlevania, and Contra fell into a vat at the chemical plant and emerged as an awesome amalgam creature with parallax scrolling and enormous sprites for the time. There's a sequence beneath a blimp that seems like it belongs in Sonic 3, with levels set in snowfields and speeding trains and blazing fast shooter sequences that look like a showcase of 16-bit blast processing somehow rendered by the 8-bit NES. The characters are so big that the system can't handle more than 2 enemies on screen at once, perhaps justified by their fear of the Dark Knight's satisfying sliding kick and the barrage of bullets he flings their way. Batman's primary weapon is a wrist-mounted cannon, and while it technically isn't a firearm in the conventional sense, slamming power-ups into the deadly machine gun gauntlet seems a little bit outside the spirit of Batman's solemn vow. However, it feels right at home within the context of this Dynamite Batman, one who enters boss battles following a fighting game style versus screen and begins each fight by charging up with red lightning. The final confrontation with the titular prodigal clown sees the Joker ensconced inside a Dr. Wily-style spaceship with a ludicrous 250,000 hit points, sending off Sunsoft's Batman saga in style, even if the publisher wasn't quite finished yet. 2 more bites at the Bat Apple still remained. First came the Game Boy edition of Return of the Joker, a curious artifact in its own right. Completely different from its NES namesake, the game suggests a hastily repurposed, unrelated ninja action title slathered with a quick coat of bat paint, judging from all the Shogun warriors and samurai that the Dark Knight disposes of within. The Genesis version is another story. Farmed out to an American studio under an extremely tight deadline, the 16-bit port inexplicably rechristened Revenge of the Joker is worse in just about every way from its predecessors. While it takes the levels and enemies from the NES game and adds some superfluous melee combat, the controls are clunky, the graphics are muddled, and the difficulty has been cranked up to the point of aggravation. Revenge's better half for the NES provided a far more impressive next-gen experience on its aging tech. Even Tommy Tallarico's soundtrack is a rare miss, with Sega's gormless Yamaha soundfront unable to compete with the crunching pulse waves of Sunsoft's 8-bit output. Revenge of the Joker sounds and feels like an exhausted sigh from a publisher who had wrung everything it could out of the Burton IP. It was time to move on, and the timing couldn't be better. If 1989 was the year of the bat, 1992 was the year of the cat, the bird, and the silver-haired industrialist. Burton's indulgent, uninhibited sequel wasn't quite as massive as the first, largely due to the dark, discomforting vibe of its repellent villains and German expressionist design, but the marketing machine established in '89 managed to churn out an entire starting lineup's worth of video games. Batman Returns got 9 games made by 6 different developers and released by 5 different publishers. 9 completely unique bespoke games tailored to each system, wildly differing in quality, and that's not counting the Tiger handheld. Today's IP tie-ins are developed over years at enormous cost and ported to increasingly indistinguishable hardware, but back in 1992 it meant that whatever 6 studios could whip up before the movie left theaters was good to go. Batman Returns was shotgunned haphazardly across every platform possible, and we won't go in-depth into them all, but the best by far were featured on the dueling 16-bit consoles that defined the 4th generation. First came Batman Returns on the Sega Genesis, developed by Malibu Interactive, a West Coast studio with games like the totally not derivative X-Mutants and Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing under its belt. Some of Malibu's talent was former Bat devs from Ocean, but the Batman Returns game they made bore a greater resemblance to Sunsoft's Genesis offering. It's a somewhat slow, side-scrolling, punch-kicky platformer with gadgets and grappling and a limited glide. The game begins in media res with the murder of Gotham's Ice Princess, which probably made for a fairly grim Christmas morning for the kids who got it in their stocking. Batman progresses through streets, sewers, and circuses, settings that were mind-numbingly shared across the entire spectrum of Returns games, though there are a few cool set pieces like sliding through the slanted halls of a ruined building. Sega's Batman Returns is plenty cinematic, with cool touches like fighting giant Art Deco statues from the film as fire-breathing bosses and a final battle against Catwoman as the credits roll. The sprite work is wonderful, but it gets lost amid the bleary blues and grays of the Genesis palette, and the sound lacks impact. Enemies die not with a gurgle or a thud, but a synthesized bleat as they vanish into a sci-fi void. It's a solid if uninspiring package, and if you feel like it lacks automotive action, you can always pop in the Sega CD version, which adds 3D Batmobile sections and better sound to the original game. Those who sided with Nintendo during the Great Console War boasted of a Batman of their own, courtesy of Konami, the Japanese studio that was already immortal for legendary licensed beat-em-ups like X-Men, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and The Simpsons. A Bat collab was long overdue. Batman Returns on Super NES is exactly what it looks like, a Final Fight clone in cape and cowl, with big sprites, juicy hit stops, and beefy sound effects as you beat the crap out of a legion of identical clowns. You can bash their heads together, hurl them through plate glass windows, or cleverly recreate moments from the movie with your trusty grappling hook. Between the screen-clearing power-ups, multiple elevator stages, and enemies with their own named life bars, it's a Konami belt scroller through and through, but it doesn't quite reach the height of the company's other IP brawlers. It's hard to say which platform had the better Batman. Like the Aladdin's, Jurassic Parks, and other dueling licensed games of the era, your decision will likely lean towards the console you grew up with. If you bore allegiance to neither Super NES or Genesis, however, there were plenty of other Batman Returns games available. If you bore allegiance to neither Super NES nor Genesis, however, there were plenty of other Batman Return games available, they just weren't as good. Konami's own NES effort is commendable, a shrunken-down beat-em-up in the mold of Double Dragon, or its own TMNT arcade port that punches above its weight on increasingly dusty tech. The similarly obsolete Sega Master System and Game Gear also received their own fairly decent 8-bit platformers, while Atari's handheld Lynx featured an extremely simple side-scroller that's barely more complex than a flip phone game. On personal computers, an infamous Amiga version ranks among the lowest dregs of Bat games, a buggy, non-responsive mess that's entirely unfun and unmemorable beyond giving you permission to punt poodles. None of these games had much in common beyond beating up men on stilts, but one title would stand above the rest in terms of ingenuity. Rather than another 2D platformer, the MS-DOS version from developer Spirit of Discovery was a PC-forward point-and-click adventure. Batman walks around the screen like he's in a Lucasfilm game, but The Dark Knight isn't one for witty banter, preferring shambling fisticuffs to insult sword fighting. It's an odd, interesting precursor to the kinds of narrative adventures future technology would eventually make possible. The average Scum Engine game has far more flavor, but Batman Returns boasts some pretty clever detective action, solving puzzles, staking out crime scenes, and interrogating crooks interrupted by agonizing combat sections. The Bat Computer is your best friend here, pouring through archives and video footage to unravel the Penguin's bid for mayor and expose the evils of Max Schreck. It's not exactly Return of the Obra Dinn in terms of sleuthing, but there's actually a bit more going on than later games' reliance on scanning augmented reality circles with detective vision. It's a rare excursion into the side of Batman's job that doesn't involve giving people concussions, and one that will be explored heavily in the years to come. By 1993, players had more than had their fill of Batman Returns, having played that stinking movie like a harp from hell.
I played this stinking city like a harp from hell.
Films come and films go, but the next guiding light for the Bat franchise would be something far more timeless, a vision that would cast a long shadow over the Dark Knight's digital future.
The fact of the matter is we each have an almost gotten Batman story. I know mine's the best, but let's hear yours anyway.
With equal parts inspiration from Burton's two movies and Max Fleischer's 1940 Superman cartoons, Batman the Animated Series is a high-water mark among all Bat media. Developed by artist Bruce Timm and writer Paul Dini and premiering in 1992, the animated series is the platonic ideal of the Dark Knight, anchored by iconic voice performances, unheard-of depth, and undeniable style. And it frequently tackled heavy subject matter that seems better suited to primetime HBO than after-school Fox Kids.
I failed you. I wish there were another way for me to say it.
Famously, the backgrounds of the show were painted on black paper instead of white, a sparse, high-contrast aesthetic that looks straight out of a Sunsoft cartridge. Timm and Dini would create dynamics and characters that lasted far beyond the show itself, eventually spawning an entire animated universe of excellent DC stories. The animated series inspired 4 video games during its initial run, although one of them barely counts. Only Konami's 1993 Game Boy title actually released under the animated series moniker, before Fox rechristened the TV show as The Adventures of Batman and Robin in a vain attempt to get more kids to watch. This also meant losing the outstanding opening bank robbery sequence, which Konami impressively recreated as a minute-long 8-bit demake. The platforming action is excellent, and there's an impressive dedication to squeeze the show's lavish production into a 2.5-inch cartridge. There's a lot of game in that little gray box. It's the first time Batman's Rogues Gallery was really showcased, featuring 7 A-list villains unrestrained by the smaller scope of a film adaptation. It's also the first time we got to play as Robin, a keystone of the comic franchise whose relationship with Bruce remains criminally underexplored in movies and games to this day. Konami followed up with a Super Nintendo title in 1994. Originally developed as a Batman the Animated Series tie-in, but published as The Adventures of Batman and Robin, the Boy Wonder is barely involved in the proceedings. Instead, a solo Batman battles through stages, styled as episodes from the TV series, complete with unique Art Deco title cards for each. Konami's mission to recreate the series' aura is served well by the SNES hardware, with its moody 256-color palette and polysymphonic MIDI sound chip that does justice to Shirley Walker's excellent score. The Super Nintendo game offers more than most Batman side-scrollers, with impressive Mode 7 boss battles, overhead Batmobile sections, and levels that mechanically complement the signature gimmicks of their respective rogues. Not to be outdone, Sega published its own Batman the Animated Series adaptation that very same year. Batman and Robin for Genesis was developed by Clockwork Tortoise, a studio formed by ex-Ocean and Malibu Interactive devs who brought with them deep roots in the European demo scene, communities of ace programmers who competed to crack open hardware and wring impossible audiovisual displays from their guts. Return of the Joker was impressive on the 8-bit NES, but Batman and Robin should have been impossible on the Genesis. The game is a technical tour de force of pseudo-3D scaling and rotation effects, utilizing brilliant tricks and scanline-level hacks to create visuals that simply shouldn't exist on hardware primarily designed to play Altered Beast.
Rise from your grave.
Even the sound itself is on a level beyond most Genesis games. Future Hitman and Assassin's Creed composer Jesper Kyd made the most out of his custom Xerox driver to push the Mega Drive's much maligned audio chip to 4 times its standard fidelity. The gameplay doesn't even pay lip service towards Batman's skill as a detective or his finely honed physical combat skills. Instead, it's a pure run-and-gun shooter in the explosive tradition of Contra and Gunstar heroes, in which the Dark Knight and his ward run to the right, flinging an infinite supply of Batarangs at full auto while their tireless arms never flag. The dynamic duo can finally be played in co-op here, though the presence of your trusty sidekick does little to alleviate the game's notorious difficulty. There's one last game to round out this brief, beautiful era before Schumacher's bat nipples arrive to change everything. Batman and Robin for the Sega CD is particularly strange. For one thing, it's a fully priced release made out of what's essentially a minigame consisting of naught but a series of vehicle stages using the old Batman Returns engine, in which the Dark Knight never actually gets out of his car. What sets the Sega CD version apart, however, has nothing to do with the gameplay. Between the boring Batmobile levels, we're treated to full motion video cutscenes that at first glance appear to be ripped directly from the animated series. That's not technically correct, since the disc actually includes completely original footage, voiced by the same cast, directed by Bruce Timm, written by Paul Dini, and animated by Tokyo Movie Shinsha, the studio behind standout episodes like Feet of Clay and Robin's Reckoning.
No! Hagen's gone! Make him stop haunting me!
The 16 minutes of footage essentially comprise a lost episode, and if you can stomach the extremely compressed and dithered 64 color video at 160p resolution, the Sega CD cutscenes are worth tracking down. The game might not be begging for a remaster, but the cutscenes desperately need one.
Virtual reality games are the wave of the future, Batman, and they're about to make you history.
The 16-bit era was very good to Batman, but a new age lurked ominously on the horizon. Casting aside Tim Burton's vision in the animated series it inspired, a very different version of the Dark Knight would soon rise, bathed in a neon glow and heralded by the haunting sounds of Seal and the Smashing Pumpkins. The games, unfortunately, wouldn't be much better.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
New director Joel Schumacher's more toyetic vision spawned just 2 titles, a sizable decrease from the previous film. For the first time, the movie tie-ins would be largely the same game ported to every platform, and who better to do that than the devs who brought Mortal Kombat into your living room. Acclaim and Probe Entertainment's Batman Forever is essentially a 2D fighter bolted to a beat-em-up, a star-crossed pairing if there ever was one, and much like the later Mortal Kombat mythology's Sub-Zero, it commits the cardinal sin of mapping jump to the up button, turning exploration into aggravation. The Dark Knight is no stranger to fighting games, but the execution in Batman Forever is frankly embarrassing, with so many esoteric button combinations that the instruction manual looks like sheet music. Like Mortal Kombat, the game uses digitized sprites of stuntmen and bogus imitations of the film's sensually molded rubber, shuffling across bland and illegible scenery with zero Schumacher swagger on screen. It's astonishing anyone managed to make a movie that's so extra into a game this dull. Batman Forever is an infamous dud, easily one of the worst entries in the series, and so bad it all but overshadows one of the weirdest. If you just read a description of Batman Forever the arcade game, you'd think it was largely the same as the console version, but look closer at its digitized sprites and you'll notice that the schlubby stand-ins have been replaced with juiced-up CGI renders a la Killer Instinct, ready to melt your brain with non-stop button-smashing action. Batman Forever the arcade game is a beat-em-up in the same sense that the Joker is a clown. A psychedelic brain dance of game UI bombards the screen with combo counters, massive health bars, and bouncing power-ups. Batman and Robin can annihilate waves of enemies with godlike ultra moves, while an announcer barks phrases like "Frenzy Mode" to a backdrop of speed metal guitars. The arcade game was built around Sega's Titan platform, the same tech that powered the 32X and Saturn. It was eventually ported to home systems, marking Batman's first foray into the 6th console generation, but its arcade origins are always on display. It's an audiovisual assault designed to stand out against the clutter of crowded cabinets, with screens stuffed with flashing enemies and cyber doppelgangers to catch your eye, and extremely loud Tommy Lee Jones voice samples to captivate your ears. If there's one thing that got people hyped back in 1995, it was Tommy Lee Jones. The Fugitive, The Client, Blown Away, Batman Forever, he was everywhere. For all its extravagance, the arcade game received little fanfare and a middling reception on release. Notably, it's the first Bat title that IGN ever reviewed, and we gave it a 5 out of 10. Beat-em-ups might have been Batman's specialty, but by the late 90s they were considered stale and old-fashioned. The same could be said about 2D graphics, which is why the dynamic duo sprinted into the third dimension for their next game, Batman and Robin. Based on the much maligned film of the same name and originally set to release alongside it, Probe needed extra time to finish the game, which forced Acclaim to delay it by a whole year, meaning that not only did Batman and Robin for PlayStation miss the movie launch, by the time it came out, the movie it was based on was already a global laughingstock. It's a shame because if you strip away the Schumacher-Vellian specifics, there's something genuinely ambitious underneath, a 3D, open-world Batman simulator bashing its head against the limitations of the PlayStation hardware. Players control one of 3 Bat characters, including Batgirl and a series first, each patrolling the city with their own mean machine. Unlike later Arkham games with their increasingly preposterous excuses for why Gotham City is bereft of people, Batman and Robin features civilian traffic to dodge and random crimes to foil. The game predates Grand Theft Auto 3 by 3 years, so don't expect too much, but there's something eerily familiar about hunting for floating question marks in the streets of Gotham. Batman and Robin has a reputation as one of the worst Batman games of all time, and it probably deserves it. Between the busted tank controls, tedious difficulty, obnoxious sound effects, and utter confusion about what you're supposed to be doing at any given point, it's not a pleasant experience. However, look a little bit deeper and you'll see some pretty fascinating stuff buried within. Gotham is littered with locations to explore, from Arkham Asylum to the Ace Chemical Plant to Crime Alley itself, all accessible on Bat-foot or by Bat vehicle. The game looks great for its age, with capes exhibiting some extremely early cloth physics, and if you're enough of a Batman and Robin sicko to somehow actually beat it, you're rewarded with a credit scene featuring dorky caricatures of the development team. They might not have delivered the best Batman game, but these doe-eyed goofballs clearly gave it all they had. It's hard to overstate how badly Schumacher's Batman and Robin damaged the Bat brand. The disastrous film and its poorly received tie-in soon became a black mark on the Caped Crusader's resume that left his status as a burgeoning video game star in question. The titles that emerged in the post-Bat Nipple era ranged from awful to merely mid, a holding pattern that circled the smoking wreckage of Schumacher's films, mining the goodwill that remained from DC's still excellent animated universe, and waiting for someone to come along and clean up the mess.
Stay cool, bird boy.
The next Batman game wasn't really a Batman game in the sense that the man under the cowl wasn't actually Bruce Wayne. Instead, it was based on Batman Beyond, the cult classic animated series set in 2039 in which scrappy teenager Terry McGinnis inherited the mantle from the retired billionaire, along with his DNA, though that somewhat icky retcon came much later. 2000's Return of the Joker for N64, PlayStation, and Game Boy Color, not to be confused with Sunsoft's NES banger, is an adaptation of the series' direct-to-video movie of the same name. A controversial film that was heavily censored for its disturbing portrayal of child brainwashing and violence, which is a bit rich considering that Batman has spent decades recruiting traumatized orphans to break bones on his behalf, but hey, who's keeping track? Anyway, the game is less interesting than the movie's reputation suggests, a bare-bones, entirely unremarkable polygonal beat-em-up that barely takes advantage of Terry's futuristic tech and only superficially scratches the surface of the extremely shway TV show it adapted. Released at the end of a console generation with exciting new hardware already on the market, Return of the Joker's existence registered as a mere blip on the radar that still remains the only dedicated Batman Beyond game we've ever gotten, though Terry has received the occasional skin and cameo in subsequent titles to remind us he still exists. Return of the Joker was the first Batman game published by Ubisoft, which started its stewardship of the IP on a bad foot and promptly made it worse with a follow-up, Gotham City Racer. One persistent tension throughout the history of Batman games is the balance between superhero action and driving segments, two very different gaming rhythms welded uneasily together. They're fine as a break, but too much emphasis on wheel and wing can humble even the mightiest franchise. A game built entirely on the driving half of the equation had been tried already, and it hadn't worked then either, and whatever refinements 3D vehicular combat had undergone in the intervening years weren't enough to make Gotham City Racer an enjoyable experience in the least. Even if the gameplay lacked, the Sega CD version at least had Paul Dini, Bruce Timm, and the anime studio that made Akira behind it. Racers debuted a new look for the Dark Knight and his Bat family based on Timm's fairly radical Batman the Animated Series retool, The New Batman Adventures. The show was genuinely great, but the license had a Kids WB size ceiling without a blockbuster film behind it.
Can a real Pokemaster get in on this game?
Still, it's a cool new look, with sharper angles and leaner characters that lend itself well to video games, and Ubisoft's subsequent titles would all work within it. First came Batman Vengeance, a third-person action-adventure game for PS2, GameCube, and Xbox in 2001, a red-letter year for third-person action-adventure games if there ever was one. Batman's particular brand of high-tech sneak-aroundery plays like an amateur in hockey pads compared to the likes of Solid Snake and Sam Fisher. Still, Ubisoft Montreal created an ambitious game that tries to encompass every aspect of Batman's extremely weird job description, but without anything to really pull you through it. Still, Ubisoft Montreal created an ambitious game that tries to encompass every aspect of Batman's extremely weird job, but without anything to really pull you through it. And that wasn't going to cut it in a year where the competition included the likes of Halo and GTA 3, to name a few. What it did offer was a faithful translation of the animated series into 3D, complete with an original story and great performances from the all-star voice cast. It's the first time the series' stacked bullpen has recorded a full-fledged video game script with codec calls and cutscenes, and the episodic presentation helps give it a premium classic animated series feel. It's a shame about the rough camera and controls, but in terms of presentation, the game is top-notch. Even the side-scrolling Game Boy Advance version punches well above its weight class in visuals and variety, from platforming and shmup sections to solving overhead Sokoban dungeons. Instead of refining the raw potential of the Vengeance approach, Ubisoft swerved back into familiar territory with the bog-standard beat-em-up Batman: The Rise of Sin Tzu. The gameplay is pretty retrograde for 2003, a bland button-mashing brawler. The most notable aspect of the gameplay is that it was our first opportunity to kick some butts as Nightwing, though the relatively low polygon count did a disservice to the former Robin's notorious physique. Sin Tzu would be Ubisoft's final Batman title, but the promised Batman renaissance was still years away. In the meantime, there was one more game to close out this extremely disappointing era, Kemco's cautionary tale, Batman Dark Tomorrow. On paper, Dark Tomorrow seemed promising. A 3D Batman game based on the comic book ideal of the character, unburdened by movies or TV, and relying on the excellent comics of the era for flavor, showcasing lesser-known characters like Cassandra Cain's Batgirl for the first and basically only time. Scott Peterson, a longtime writer and editor of DC's Batman books, was tapped to write the story, a serviceably cinematic tale involving Ra's al Ghul threatening to flood the world's coastlines while Batman is busy rescuing Jim Gordon from the bedlam of Arkham Asylum. Squint, and the concept kind of resembles Rocksteady's revolutionary game that was still 6 years off, though the execution was anything but. What began as a sprawling open world a la Spider-Man 2 instead became a linear, laborious trek through colorless warehouses, docks, factories, and sewers before schlepping through Arkham. Fixed camera angles give a nauseating effect, mocking the very notion of a 180-degree rule and making combat borderline impossible. On the rare occasion the Dark Knight actually knocks someone down, he has to handcuff every single enemy with a vibe-shattering, mandatory cutscene you'll watch 1,000 times. One might reasonably expect some kind of payoff for enduring scores of obligatory cuffing animations, but in Batman Dark Tomorrow, the reward for your suffering is likely death. The game has multiple endings, all but one of which results in the death of Batman or an apocalyptic global flood. Even if you defeat Ra's al Ghul, millions will be unalived unless you've solved a puzzle the game never even hints at using an ability you've had no reason to touch the entire time. If you want a summary of Batman games in 2003, Dark Tomorrow just about covers it. The character was a punchline post-Schumacher, the DCAU was winding down, and the game's performance over the last decade ranged from aggressively mid to utterly atrocious. The comic books were still cooking, but things looked bleak on the Bat front as far as pop culture and gaming were concerned. Something had to give, and something would. In the immortal but factually dubious words of Aaron Eckhart, the night is always darkest before the dawn.
The night is darkest just before the dawn. I promise you, the dawn is coming.
Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins could hardly be called a cultural phenomenon, at least not on the scale of breakfast cereals and McDonald's commemorative mugs, but the quietly confident film was key to repairing the franchise's reputation and building a bridge to the future. Among the movie's modest merchandising was a video game tie-in from EA and Eurocom that offered a tantalizing glimpse into Batman's digital future. Licensed games were still viewed with suspicion in 2005, but the advent of DVD had finally given developers something to work with. Movies came on discs now, with animated menus, bonus features, and the general aura of a premium product. Savvy publishers started applying that same logic to their games, filling the newfound storage space with authentic voice acting and high-quality film footage to create a package that deserves space next to the movie on your shelf. The entire cast of Batman Begins showed up to record a ton of new dialogue with the lone exception of Gary Oldman. Liam Neeson, perhaps compensating, gives his very best voice performance this side of Ponyo.
Have you finally learned to do what is necessary?
No, she's turned into a human.
Cutscenes are pulled directly from the movie, though the clips were carefully edited to protect the only twist from 2005 more spoiled than Snape killing Dumbledore.
Voldemort killed Harry! Harry comes back to life and kills Voldemort!
Batman Begins looks good and sounds great with some nifty ideas like gadgets and interrogations and picture-in-picture cameras in the grounded stealth vein of Splinter Cell. It works with Nolan's muted aesthetic, but feels less than compelling at a time when superhero games were defined by simulated web swinging and ultimate destruction. Most notable is the emphasis on generating fear, stalking rooms, and spiking enemy heartbeats as Christian Bale growls threats at them. It's a genuinely forward-thinking use of a characteristic that hadn't been exploited in Batman games before, and it clearly foretells the pants-soiling terror the Dark Knight would be inflicting in the coming years. It's unclear whether Eurocom's game directly inspired Rocksteady or the Arkham series was simply destined to arrive, a line of evolution traced from the earliest PC titles through the awkward third-person experiments at the turn of the millennium. It was clear that Batman games were building towards something after a brief stint through the toy aisle.
This isn't a toy.
It kind of is.
No, actually it's a highly sophisticated interlocking brick system.
Traveler's Tales had eked out a pretty good niche for itself as the studio that made endearing, entirely serviceable LEGO games based on bricked-up adaptations of Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Breezy co-op puzzle platformers exploding with good-natured gags and tiny plastic pieces. 2008's LEGO Batman was the first licensed LEGO title built on an original story rather than an existing film, which meant raiding 80 years of Bat lore and having a blast with it. LEGO Batman is a lovely mashup of all things Batman, with music and minifigs pulled from all corners of the canon and a refreshing indifference to continuity. It plays like every other LEGO game, which is to say it's fun, accessible, and designed to be beaten by 6-year-olds, but can be enjoyed by all ages. It was also a massive hit, prompting Warner Bros. To buy the studio and greenlight LEGO Batman as its own sub-franchise, complete with 2 open-world, fully voice-acted sequels and its own utterly charming movie, an adaptation of other adaptations.
Batman works alone. That's my motto. Copyright Batman.
We'll return to the Danish delights of LEGO soon enough, but we're about to hit the turning point for Batman, a seismic arrival that immediately split the history of superhero games in two.
This is what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object.
Batman Begins was a modest success, but it didn't really set the world aflame. Its 2008 sequel, on the other hand, earned $1 billion and became a cultural institution that changed college dorm rooms forever on the back of a generational acting performance from Zeus' Tiny Lister.
Give it to me, and I'll do what you should have did 10 minutes ago.
The Dark Knight is a top contender for the greatest Batman movie ever made, and it never got a video game, but it wasn't for lack of trying. Pandemic Studios spent years trying under the auspices of EA, but a disastrous development led to the game's cancellation. EA took a $100 million bath on the projects and defeated let the Batman rights lapse. Eidos Interactive snapped them up and hired London-based Rocksteady Studios to create a brand new concept. 20 years after Ocean's Cape Crusader first shuffled off to Specky, the Brits were back in charge of Batman, and this time they weren't faffing around. Rocksteady had only made one game before Arkham Asylum. Urban Chaos Riot Response kinda sounds like Batman's job description, but the FPS gave zero indication of the all-time classic the studio was about to cook up. Without a movie or show to anchor the project, the team at Rocksteady needed a source of truth for the new Dark Knight it was about to create from scratch, so they turned to the folks who had done it best before. Batman the Animated Series is one of the most complete and durable versions of the character ever conceived, one that cracked the bat so thoroughly that every adaptation since lives in its Art Deco shadow. Rocksteady hired Paul Dini, a driving force of Batman the Animated Series who co-created Harley Quinn, along with the actors from the show to reprise their roles for some of their final performances. Gotham's rogues got the biggest glow up, finally fulfilling their video game potential as the bosses they were born to be. Their new designs were dirty and lived in and dripping with character as they taunt and belittle Batman's defeated corpse while the life drains from his eyes. Refreshes like Harley's would ripple beyond gaming, but Arkham's biggest impact was on the industry itself. For starters, it proved that licensed titles didn't have to be linked to a multimedia event. The talent and technology had progressed to the point where an iconic IP alone could sustain an adaptation custom tailored for the digital medium, even though Batman games had spent the last 30 years proving the opposite. Every Batman title up to this point had been derivative by design. Sunsoft's best stuff was basically Ninja Gaiden and Contra, while countless beat-em-ups tried to be Streets of Rage with a grappling hook. From Mortal Kombat to Monkey Island, virtually all the Batman adaptations before Arkham borrowed their grammar from other games, but Arkham Asylum was the first to lend its language to others. Rocksteady's free-flow combat system, snapping to enemies and smacking them to a brawling beat with chain combos and telegraphed counters in scored battles, became a new baseline almost overnight. Like Resident Evil 4 turning every third-person shooter into an over-the-shoulder affair, Arkham Asylum created a new template for 3D melee combat that developers spent the next decade copying wholesale. The same could be said about the sandboxy, stealth-focused Predator rooms and especially Batman's detective vision, the augmented reality UX innovation that infected the industry like it was airborne. If you've made it this far, it should be abundantly clear that the Arkham series stands cowl and shoulders above the dozens of Batman games that came before it. The only real question is, which is the best Arkham game? Many purists prefer the 2009 original. Arkham Asylum traps Batman in the titular loony bin for the second worst night of his life, a stripped-down John Carpenter premise that perfectly suits the lean, deliberately contained experience. Hunting down the Asylum's colorful occupants is a linear affair, with straightforward progression and a tightly controlled map pointing Batman down the path towards the final brutal frame-mogging.
Showtime, Batman!
Some would liken the first Arkham game to Metroid, with gadgets that expand Batman's abilities and open new paths through the Madhouse's many wings. Others might note a spiritual resemblance to classic 3D Zeldas and its puzzle-solving and dungeon-style gating. Real ones, however, know that Arkham Asylum is a better remake of Metal Gear Solid 1 than the Twin Snakes. However you prefer to diagnose its greatness, Arkham Asylum immediately established itself as a new franchise. It sold 4 million copies on the strength of its excellence alone, with nary a Hollywood star or viral new villain in sight. There would never be a Batfleck tie-in or an in-universe Pattinson interquel. The world Rocksteady created was reason enough. Warner Brothers, which published the series and later owned Eidos, wanted more, and so did the fans, and they were about to feast like Dick Grayson in the Batcave fridge. Is that a Batman Forever call-out? I think it might be. Arkham City tripled its predecessor's sales and then some, bathed in so many critical accolades and Game of the Year awards that it plastered them all over its infamous white cover art. Freed from the Asylum's walls, Batman is finally free to stalk the streets he's spent his life protecting, or at least a cordoned-off section of the city turned open-air Supermax prison. Not quite Gotham proper, but the wider scope and limited space create a dense urban playground just big enough to make brilliant use of Batman's new traversal, gliding from rooftops, dive-bombing your terrified prey, and grapple-boosting back up to the gritty black skyline. Catwoman and Robin join the playable roster, and even more villains jump in the fray, with a bigger swinging story starring Ra's al Ghul and a dying Joker out for one last laugh. It was Paul Dini's final entry in the series, and to many, the definitive one. For a lot of players, Arkham City was the Batman game they'd always wanted, and the only one they'd ever need again. It lacked the surprise impact and more intimate scale of Asylum, but if there's a number 1 and 2 among Batman games, both of these titles are still duking it out for the top spot.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
The Bat Revolution probably wouldn't have mattered much if all you owned was a Wii or a DS. The mainline Arkham games wouldn't appear on Nintendo hardware until the Switch era, and the best those players had was a cheerful side-scroller based on the Golden Age-inspired Brave and the Bold. Fun on its own terms, but cold comfort for anyone desperate to defeat Hugo Strange.
Hugo Strange!
Demand for Arkham was high enough that Warner Brothers ordered a spin-off without Rocksteady at the wheel, commissioning WB Montreal to produce a stopgap prequel while the A-Team took their time on the third game in the trilogy. The result is Arkham Origins, an extremely iterative reskin of City that nonetheless has genuine merits of its own. Set on Christmas Eve like a Shane Black action movie, Gotham's streets are lawless and empty beneath a blinding snowstorm, with a $50 million bounty on Batman's head and a murderer's row of costume assassins coming to collect. The classic voice cast sits this one out, but the replacements are up to the challenge, with Troy Baker's Joker in particular filling Hamill's comically oversized shoes.
We both exist because of them! Give up!
Boss fights are an improvement over the previous 2 games, and encounters with Deathstroke and a DLC mission against Mr. Freeze are remembered fondly to this day. Unfortunately, it's not exactly easy to play them on the last 2 generations of Xbox or PlayStation. While it's still available on PC via Steam, Arkham Origins is long gone from console digital storefronts, and it's genuinely a shame. The game suffered from a buggy launch that was a stark contrast to Rocksteady's rock-solid polish, and the combat timing off just enough to betray our built-up muscle memory, but it's still an enjoyable romp through a lavishly produced Arkham game, and we don't get many of those anymore. What we do have plenty of are side-scrolling Metroidvanias, including one starring our very own Cape Crusader. The existence of Arkham Origins Blackgate, developed for the 3DS and PlayStation Vita by former Metroid Prime staff, is an oddity in the modern age, a spin-off of a spin-off designed for the limitations of handheld consoles and a throwback to the strange small-scale Batman guide-ins that once drained the batteries of our Lynxes and Game Gears. The 2.5D search action shenanigans of Blackgate weren't exactly exactly the second coming of Symphony of the Night, but it and Origins were enough to keep the lights on until Rocksteady's last ride was as ready as it was ever going to be. The time was ripe for Arkham Knight and the beginning of the end.
Maybe this is all coming to an end.
What is?
The Batman.
Rocksteady spent the 4 years following Arkham City creating the biggest, best-looking Batman game ever made. We would finally have free reign of Gotham City proper, albeit an evacuated one, rendered in jaw-dropping, rain-slick detail. It asked more of the PS4 and Xbox One than either wanted to give and suffered a disastrous PC port, but on hardware that can actually handle it, Arkham Knight is a stunning technical and artistic achievement. Everything is seamless. Gameplay blending into cutscenes, gliding bleeding into jump scares, the Joker's mind game warping your perception of reality without ever really breaking the flow.
Excuse me, sir. There's no smoking in here.
Navigating a world 5 times larger than its predecessor meant it was finally time to give gamers the keys. The Batmobile is always a risky proposition in Batman games, has a long history of feeling obligatory at best, but Rocksteady heard that Batman liked quality of life features and smooth controls, so they pimped his ride to make it one of the most intuitive vehicles ever controlled in any video game. Summoning it anywhere in an instant and leaping out at full speed is an absolute joy, at least until it's not. At a certain point, Arkham Knight begins to resemble an arcade tank simulator, less pedal to the metal and more Metal Slug, and not as mini-games or breather levels, but as a significant chunk of the critical path. The final boss fight is a tank battle, and the only way to reach the real ending is to find every Riddler trophy and complete his incredibly aggravating Batmobile challenges. Give up before you get all 243 trophies, and you'll never see Batgirl and Robin get married. Arkham Knight feels like the opposite of a wedding, a bleak funeral for a franchise that literally begins with Batman's eulogy and only gets grimmer from there. The Dark Knight is dying throughout, poisoned from within by the also dead Joker's infected blood. The much-hyped plot twist was obvious to anyone who's been on Tumblr since 2010, and while Mark Hamill delivers a barnstorming grand finale for his 23 years with the character, he squandered that goodwill to star in the blasphemous Killing Joke animated movie. It's all kind of a bummer. Batman Arkham Knight tries to be Metal Gear Solid 4 and winds up as the Seinfeld finale of gaming, a high-quality, impeccably crafted send-off that doesn't really end where you want it to leave things. In the gaming space, Batman has been more or less dead ever since. At least in his own games. He's essentially the star of 2 cinematic DC epics from NetherRealm, cast in the Injustice series as the reluctant conscience of a fascist Elseworlds universe. The Dark Knight has appeared in some MMOs and certainly hasn't been a stranger to Fortnite, but Warner Brothers has seemed oddly hesitant to follow Rocksteady's act, and you can't entirely blame it. Rather than compete with Arkham on its own terms, Batman the Telltale series and its sequel, The Enemy Within, carve out a quieter lane with an all-new alternate canon molded to its traditional point-and-click adventure formula. It feels like a CW version of the animated series, a little low budget and pretty melodramatic, but with some interesting twists on the lore. Thomas Wayne turns out to have been a ruthless crook, while Bruce strikes up an unlikely friendship with a sympathetic John Doe on his slow, sad journey toward Jokerdom.
I told you I'd see you again, didn't I?
An interesting diversion that at least tried something different than the decent VR games that tried to tap into Arkham's waning spark with mixed to, that's kinda neat, results. The bat signal went dark after Arkham Knight. Movies and animated series, once the engine behind an unreasonable number of video game tie-ins had stopped generating them entirely, superhero games have struggled across the board, but we still see blockbuster hits like Insomniac's Spider-Man games, which owe a massive debt to Rocksteady, show that a Batman game could still make bank, but Warner Brothers just seems too intimidated by Arkham's shadow to step back into it. So, they killed him. Twice. 2022's Gotham Knights opens with Bruce Wayne's death and thrusts you into the grieving boots of his proteges as they prowl the streets in a grindy, co-op heavy crusade against the Court of Owls. Batman's absence doesn't have to be a death sentence for a Batman game. Some incredible stories have been told about Bruce's found family honoring his legacy, and the Bat Kids make a valiant effort to keep the family business open. But Gotham Knights mostly feels like a reminder of how long it had been since we'd gotten a good Batman game. If we're being generous, Gotham Knights has the DNA of a great Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. It stars 4 youths wearing blue, red, purple, and almost orange accented outfits, stealthily fighting crime with complementary martial arts weapons. These youths just happen to be white-collar human vigilantes rather than green-skinned mutant reptiles. If we're being reductive, Gotham Knights should have been called Gotham City Imposters, except that name was already taken by Monolith's forgotten 2012 multiplayer FPS about rival bat and clown-themed gangs, which I think was the first Batman game game that didn't have Batman in it. Tainted by live service ick, poorly executed, barely marketed, and roundly rejected, Gotham Knights limply came and went. An embarrassing stumble, but surely not an indicator of the future success of all subsequent Batman-related games, right? Well, then Rocksteady came along. After Arkham Knight, rumors abounded of Rocksteady's next project. From Superman to TMNT, fans were salivating at the thought of a new third-person adventure with fresh characters, reimagined in the studio's bulky bump-mapped style. Years of silence were followed by the deflating announcement that Rocksteady would return to the Arkhamverse for an online looter-shooter starring the Suicide Squad, a popular anti-hero team with some Bat-villain experience who had begun to seriously overstay their cultural welcome by the game's original release date of 2020. When the game finally flopped out of development hell in 2024, this courageous new venture looked more like a suicide mission. There are plenty of reasons to take umbrage with Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. A big one is that it's a textbook example of the unsustainability of the AAA live service business model that's been shoehorned into everything this console generation. But its worst offense? Harley Quinn shoots Batman point blank in the head, presumably in that little part of his mask that for some reason he keeps completely unprotected. But in any case, it's a summary execution after an okay boss fight with little pomp or circumstance, just a stern lecture and a see you later for the character that Rocksteady had spent a decade building up. It wasn't a surprise exactly. The game's subtitle clearly states what Task Force X plans to do to DC's most prominent superhero team, but in terms of so-called disrespectful send-offs, it makes The Last Jedi look like Logan, especially considering it was released after the untimely passing of forever Batman actor Kevin Conroy. A retcon buried in Season 4's final content update and delivered in static comic panels thanks to cuts at Rocksteady revealed that the Justice League we'd been killing the entire time were actually clones, which was surely little comfort to the few who were still playing the $200 million failure. Most of the people who made Arkham had long since departed from Rocksteady. We would never get a proper Arkham game again, and the character that survived Joel Schumacher, screaming about Martha's, and the ZX Spectrum had now been killed twice in 2 consecutive years across 2 separate games. So if you want a live Batman in a video game, you're gonna have to build him yourself. Lego Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight isn't a reinvention, but it's not a retread either. Instead, it's shaping up to be a celebration, a rapturous balloon parade dedicated to the past 8 decades of Batman, and it's a lot more fun than just killing him off. Batman of all eras are rendered in cheerful plastic with an encyclopedic roster of suits, vehicles, and set pieces to serve them. Based on the more substantial systems Traveler's Tales debuted in LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, Legacy won't play exactly like an Arkham game, but the open world evokes everything that we loved about exploring Gotham in Rocksteady's classic series. But a lovingly curated museum isn't going to solve the long-term problem. Arkham got a Batman right, but it didn't get the Batman because there is no one singular Batman to get. There are untold multitudes to the character that have never been explored in gaming, lost somewhere between the movie-based side-scrollers and Arkham setting the standard. Outside of cosmetics, Frank Miller's cranky old Dark Knight has never been in a video game, and neither has Grant Morrison's time-tumbling, dark-side-slaying master of prep time. Where's the axe-swinging character action game starring the latest darling, Scott Snyder's absolute butlerless truck-driving Batman? Where is our Batman RPG? We're 85 years into Batman games, and we've barely scratched the surface. So, where do you want to see Batman go next in the video game space? Let us know in the comments below.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
That was a look at Batman's long history of video games. If you want more videos like this that aren't quite as long and in-depth, be sure to check out our still pretty deep dives on the best, worst, and weirdest games based on Dragon Ball, Terminator, The Simpsons, and South Park. And if you'd like a look back at some of the weirder moments in Pokemon's 30-year history of causing controversy, we got one of those too. Thank you so much for watching, and for all the latest on Bat games, Bat comics, Bat movies, Bat shows, and Batman, as well as all sorts of stuff that doesn't involve bats at all, keep it right here on IGN.